any of these dysfunctions, it's multifactorial. So there's going to be a host of causes, and I'm of course going to focus on the factors that are related to physiotherapy. So there's going to be other things that are going to play in that I'll mention, but of course I'm going to be focusing on the pelvic physiotherapy piece. And the good news is that really non-invasive, like very conservative, very straightforward strategies can actually be highly effective for these problems. And that's the piece that I think people just don't know that. They just don't realize that these are options. So enuresis, this is the term for almost the pediatric version of incontinence that I mentioned before. So the word actually comes from a Greek word meaning to void urine. And so just like incontinence in adults, this can occur either during the day or at night. So really we're talking about involuntary loss of urine, right? It can happen at day or night. A lot of the times, though, you'll see the term enuresis restricted to night, and it's called nocturnal enuresis, and it's bedwetting. And this seems to be, I think people feel like they can have a better handle on what's happening during the day, and then it's at night that there ends up being a problem. But oftentimes what we see is the reason why there aren't any accidents during the day is that a pattern of defensive voiding has been set up. Just making sure that, you know, your child, oh, do you have to go pee? Go pee, and making sure you're on top of it, all the while you're really disrupting the natural neuroscience. And then, of course, at night, when you're not there on top of the situation, this overactive bladder is just going to contract, right? So usually when there is a problem that manifests at nighttime, it's stemming from a problem that's occurring in a 24-hour cycle, right? It's the same thing as sleep. You know, if you're struggling with sleep issues with your child, your baby or your toddler, well, usually there's a problem with daytime napping and sleeping over that 24-hour cycle, and then you're maybe just, it's not as noticeable to you during the day, but then at night it's a big problem because your child won't sleep at night. It's the same thing. We have to be mindful what's happening through the full 24-hour period to actually nip something like this in the bud. So if there's bedwetting going on, it really needs to be a sign for you to take a look at what sort of your whole 24-hour cycle looks like to be able to nip any issues in the bud, okay? So if we're going to actually kind of define what nocturnal enuresis is, like as defined, it's that involuntary loss of urine that only happens at night. And as I said, this doesn't mean there's just a dysfunction at night. This is just when it's manifesting. And children generally are not officially diagnosed or considered anuretic until they're 5 years old. So there is this kind of, I guess you would call meme or like misnomer in the medical opinion where the bladder takes approximately 5 years to mature, and there really isn't a ton of evidence to substantiate this. It's just one of those memes, sort of like drink 8 glasses of water a day, which like has nothing to do with anything, and it's not proven. It's just one of these weird things that everyone just believes. So that's generally the thought. I would say that you can definitely pick up dysfunctional patterns way before that. I mean, if you're toilet learning your child when they're 2.5 or 3, you know, why would you kind of allow dysfunctional patterns to go on for 2 years? And it just doesn't really make sense. But certainly in the medical world, no one will really get too excited if you're having problems and your child isn't 5 yet, okay? That being said, I think that, you know, as empowered parents, you can be picking up some dysfunctions way before that, and then they're a lot easier to correct. So the diagnosis would be a child 5 to 6 years old who has 2 or more bedwetting episodes per month. That's what our medical system would consider as, you know, a positive diagnosis. Or a child older than 6 having 1 or more a month. Right? So the idea is as the child is getting older and more mature, it's sort of less accepted that these issues should be happening. So what are some of the conservative treatments that exist and that you might be aware of? Well, probably the most popular one that still exists today is the bedwetting alarm. So some of you might have heard about this. So this is the concept where literally an alarm is set to wake up the child, and it means waking up you. to make sure you're allowing the child to go to the washroom, okay? And that is something that's still used today. I just had a client this week who was talking to me about this is the program that they have in place, and they feel like they're finally getting like some progress with this. So again, from my perspective, I see some issues in terms of like training yourself to kind of then wake up at night to be voiding, and this is certainly not the route I would go first, but that's one thing that's out there. Positive reinforcement systems, so just like how a lot of people implement this type of thing for toilet learning during the day, trying to kind of positively reinforce the child to kind of align their behavior of correctly toileting with something positive that they want, and hopefully that reinforcing that behavior. That's another thing that's been implemented even for nocturnal enuresis. More recently, there has been work around diet and doing elimination diets, getting on really anti-inflammatory diets, and that's been found to help. And certainly we know that there's a huge connection between constipation and bladder function. So there's this constant interaction between the gut and the bladder or the uterus. So if the gut's really inflamed, and sadly our conventional diet is highly inflammatory, right? So if your gut is inflamed, then, I mean, you're talking about, you know, a structure that's right next door. So we always kind of say, like, if the one house is on fire, pretty soon the one beside it's going to get on fire too. And we always see this crosstalk between the gut and the bladder and the uterus, that we get this inflammation across all structures. So it makes perfect sense to me why having an elimination diet would certainly help. Also, the diet we traditionally eat is really high in refined wheat, and it's stripped of all fiber. And we know how important fiber is for motility too. So really getting on like a proper whole foods, like non-inflammatory diet has been found to be helpful. And then it's much more recent that pelvic health physiotherapy has been acknowledged as being really useful in helping with some of these issues. And at the end of the day, we said at the beginning that these problems are multifactorial, and we'll go into the nuts and bolts in a minute. So it really does also take a multi-pronged approach to get it better, right? So constipation. So this is defined as infrequent or difficult stool passage. And I have difficult passage bolded because many people I've noticed really define constipation by how many times are you actually eliminating fecal matter per day or per week. There's a lot less consideration for what does the process of that elimination look like. Are you straining? Is it difficult to pass? So if you're having a bowel movement every day or every other day, and to you feel regular, but it's actually quite difficult to actually go through that process every day, that's a problem, right? And we know that straining can micro tear the pelvic floor. It can, that pain of elimination can really set up a response in your central nervous system to start to guard and to fear that elimination process. So it's really important to be aware of, if your child is eliminating every day, that's great, but what's the process like? Is it easy breezy? What does the fecal matter look like, right? And if you're noticing that, or eliminating it every day and they can do it, but it seems like it's a major effort, then that's something that you want to start thinking about and kind of nipping it in the bud sooner rather than later, okay? We know that the actual frequency of elimination varies from child to child, right? It's going to vary from person to person. But these are some standards, is to aim to at least have one bowel movement a day. According to the medical thinking, anything less than 3 times per week is considered constipation. And as I said, the real emphasis in our healthcare system is around that frequency. It's less around the process. And watching for really large stools, because that means just the matter is really getting built up and it's not being eliminated as often as it should. And that matter in our body is toxic, right? We don't want toxic matter in our body. We want to flush it out. We want to be getting that out so we're just healthier. So what are some common causes and perpetuators of constipation? Well, one for children can be just avoidance of bowel movements. So, you know, we can have an issue where the child is just ignoring those physiological signals to void. Sometimes that can just be because they're really excited and engaged with something else that in their mind is taking more priority, right? You can have sort of discomfort if the stools are quite big, or unpleasant sensory association with that process. And so one of the things we talk about, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, is how important it is to have a proper toileting setup. So a lot of times when individuals are starting to have their child toilet learn, they will use one of those inserts that go on a grown person's toilet. And I mean, even our standard toilets are a nightmare for us as it is. They're up way too high, right? This is why everyone should be using a stool to have their feet on so you can be in the right mechanical alignment to properly eliminate matter from your body. So that's one thing, but they'll have an insert and then the child sitting on top. So when someone is in a position where they cannot, one, they don't have their knees above their hips, they're not in the same position we would actually advocate for adults, but they also don't even have their feet on the ground. They can't balance themselves. They can't feel grounded. It's really uncomfortable. And from a sensory perspective, that really taps into their system. So that's something to be very mindful of. You have a child that's kind of avoiding that, and that's your setup. That's something you really need to look at. That's a really unpleasant sensory situation, okay? And we'll talk about optimal toilet setup more later. And then again, if there's actually any like frank fissures and skin compromise in that area, that's going to make it uncomfortable to eliminate. So that's going to be another reason why maybe over time a child will start to avoid that, right? Sometimes what happens with this avoidance of bowel movements is that you end up having sort of an operating rhythm in your household that really doesn't align physiologically with when your child needs to have a bowel movement, for example. So that's something else to think about. You know, first thing in the morning, we get a reflex, a natural reflex that occurs after you've been up and you've had something to eat. Then you get a natural gastric reflex that usually will initiate you to want to have a bowel movement. And if you have a schedule that's kind of set up that when that's happening, you know, your child's in the car, or they're sort of forced to ignore that signal, that's another problem. We talked about diet and how, you know, our standard diet is just so stripped of optimal fiber. Certainly the food industry will tote like wheat products and certain packaged products as being high in fiber, but that is not the kind of fiber that our gut needs. Our gut needs fiber from whole real food like fruits and vegetables, so that's important. Lack of general physical movement is another big one, right? And so that's another thing to just have on the radar in terms of what is that movement pattern looking like for your child. And then anxiety. So anxiety, we know that anxiety can be really held in the pelvic floor. There's a lot of people that hold their anxiety sort of in their shoulders or the upper traps, and there's a lot of people who hold their anxiety in their pelvic floor. So children often hold their anxiety in their pelvic floor. So that can be another thing that we really have to tap into is if there's anxiety issues and how to overcome those. So not honoring those physiological signals. So again, this is, I would say, somewhere where parents actually have quite a bit of control in terms of where they can maybe start to intervene, because they can kind of start to watch what's happening, and they can also start to make sure that their schedule, their rhythm that they set for the family is going to be more in line with the child's physiology, okay? When a child does not honor this physiological signal, they'll end up kind of like holding in that fecal matter that's wanting to come out, and kind of suppressing that urge. And over time, that perpetual pattern of holding will really tighten up those pelvic floor muscles that are at the back, and will also start to disrupt sort of the natural reflexes and neuroscience that are innate in our body. It will start to disrupt that over time. And And so, of course, the longer this goes on, the more complex and layered the situation becomes. So this is why I'm suggesting that you might want to be thinking of these things before your child is 5 or 6, the way our medical standards are set, because it can become a lot layered. You could have an issue that's a lot more about just sensory and poor setup in your bathroom, and if you nip that in the bud, then you're good. But if that manifests, then it becomes permanently tightened muscles, then it becomes a massive anxiety, then you might get the development of a fissure, then it becomes more complicated. So, you know, the sooner you can kind of recognize the situation and usually deal with it with some pretty straightforward measures, the better. Okay, so one of the conditions that is a really common presentation of constipation that I don't think people realize is a condition called Encopresis. And really it presents as fecal incontinence. So it presents as, you know, if you're changing your child and you think, oh, actually there's a little bit of fecal matter in their underwear that's like leaking out. Like my child is actually having some fecal incontinence. Like what's going on? A lot of the times that's actually a further on manifestation of constipation. And actually the liquid stool, because there's hard stool that's in the rectum, and then there's liquid stool that's being created that's actually seeping around that hard stool and coming out. Okay, so usually in those cases, still it's constipation at the crux of it that needs to be corrected. So just to define encopresis, it's the repeated passage of feces into inappropriate places. Fecal incontinence must occur for at least once a month for 3 months for it to be defined as this problem of encopresis. And for this one, the child must be at the chronological and developmental age of 4 years old before a diagnosis of this can be made. So we see this a lot more often in boys, approximately 80%. We see that this tends to be aligned with an incontinence problem, so the enuresis. So we see these two go back and forth. And certainly we see this in adults also. A lot of the clients that we treat for bladder issues, they also usually have some degree of constipation and gut problem also, and just low-grade inflammation going on in their body, and we see this in adults too. This condition has actually been kind of correlated with ADHD, and really that just highlights the multifaceted nature that some of these problems can have. And as I said, it really is kind of correlated with this underlying issue of constipation that just wasn't managed properly. So ultimately you get this dysfunctional evacuation cycle that's set up, right? So this is true with any of these voiding dysfunctions. That you have this cycle, that you have the anxiety, and then you kind of have this protective contraction around the anal sphincter. Then that's going to lead to difficulty evacuating. Then that's going to lead to those larger hard stools that are actually painful to pass on evacuation, and it kind of sets up this cycle. So really, as pelvic physios, we want to actually intervene at each one of those steps to help. So here's just a schematic of sort of what I was describing with the encopresis. So that's essentially what happens. So again, this kind of constipation is on this continuum with the fecal incontinence, and we know it's highly correlated with the urinary incontinence. So really these dysfunctions are kind of intermixed, and that's why I prefer to just term them as voiding dysfunctions, because our approach to correct them usually will overlap. But essentially you end up over time getting rectal distension. You'll get hypercontractility and hyposensitivity, so that rectal sphincter will become less sensitive to that stretch feeling over time. You're going to have the evacuation difficulty. You'll, of course, over time get that accumulation of stool in the rectum. You'll get that stimulation of the rectoanal inhibitory reflex. It's going to inhibit what should normally happen. You'll get the internal sphincter will relax, but the external sphincter, it fatigues out and just gets really, really tight. And then, of course, you end up with fecal incontinence. When that external sphincter finally relaxes, you'll get leakage. So we know that there are fairly significant consequences to these problems. We know that kind of social isolation results, decreased self-esteem, perpetuation of anxiety and depression, and I would say in some cases there's going to be an element of anxiety that probably feeds into all of these problems in the first place. Some cases it might just be mild, but it's important to be aware of that. But certainly this will just perpetuate that. And then also it can create a lot of tension between the child and parents, because parents can be very well-meaning, trying to kind of sort this problem out, but in many instances have approaches that really are discordant with the natural physiology of the child, and then that can kind of perpetuate the dysfunction and create a lot of tension. So we really want to have this multifaceted treatment approach at each stage. So the first stage, anxiety and avoidance. So what would some of our strategies be here? Well, we would educate the child and the parents in terms of what might be going on with anxiety, how that might hold in the pelvic floor, how the pelvic floor communicates with the gut, with the rectum, with the bladder, and really establishing a much more positive attitude towards toileting, because of course by this time it's just become a stress for everyone. So really trying to reestablish it as, you know, a new fresh start and as something positive. Deep breathing techniques to try to get the diaphragm and the pelvic floor partnered together, similar to what we do with women, can work. Very specific hip opener yoga poses can be really good, as can be calming essential oils just to wind down that autonomic nervous system and try to tap into the anxiety. So you want to be mindful about sort of your rhythm and approach to toileting and to going to the bathroom, but you really want to de-dramatize the routine, right? And usually there's been so much drama hyped up around it that it's just made it worse. So then what would we do for the protective contraction of that anal sphincter? So ultimately, the child does need to learn how to relax the anal sphincter. And sometimes helping the child to really reframe what is threatening and what is safe, and that's where a pelvic physio can really kind of assist with that. A lot of times if, you know, you're actually able to set up where that person would be going to the bathroom as a place they want to be. If you have a very stark, sterile bathroom that, you know, from a child's perspective seems like a place they don't want to be, and you've had them sitting up where they have a lot of this sensory mismatch, that's not going to be good. But if you get it set up with some nice warm cozy things in there, and they're on like a proper little potty where their feet can touch the ground, they're in the right position, and they've had some say into terms of what that space and environment looks like, that can help them to understand this is a safe place, this is not a threatening place, and really helping them to kind of break that cycle. As I said, deep breathing can be useful here. A lot of the times we'll suggest actually that, you know, once a child has got a little bit better at deep breathing, similar to adults, we actually try to teach them how to do a very gentle pelvic floor contraction so that when they release it, they really know what that feeling of the release feels like. And often we'll suggest that they try that just a couple times sitting on the toilet before they actually go. So they're feeling like they're a little bit more empowered, it's a little safer, and then usually once you've contracted a muscle, it actually relaxes more than it would have otherwise right after you've contracted it. And so that can be a strategy that can actually work nice for right when they are eliminating. Just like we teach women reverse Kegel exercises when their pelvic floors are too tight, we can do the same with children. So a traditional Kegel is really a pelvic floor contraction that's sustained for 6 to 8 seconds. And so a reverse Kegel is really focusing on the opposite. It's emphasizing the relaxation of the pelvic floor for about 6 to 8 seconds. And it's partnered with an inhale breath, whereas a Kegel contraction is partnered with an exhale breath. And then if needed, we can apply manual therapy techniques. Very, very just gentle rectal sort of stimulation just to help the child to just learn how to relax that sphincter if that's needed. So what would we then do for the evacuation difficulty? So again, I talked about this setup in the bathroom. It really needs to be pleasant. You need to be using a toilet insert and a stool. Like, your child needs to be stable and grounded and feel safe and comfortable, right? If they feel like they're about to fall through the toilet or their feet can't touch the ground, that's a really sort of threatening experience. And if there's already other anxieties going on, that's certainly not going to help. So your bathroom setup is really, really key. And there are a lot of instances where people have been able to nip these problems in the bud just by changing the bathroom setup, implementing a few of these things, changing the approach, and not kind of getting onto this piece about worrying that your child's going to have an accident all the time, and actually trusting them that their body signals are going to tell them when they need to go, and if they have a safe place to do their business, they'll go. It's that type of attitude, okay? You want to make use of that gastrocolic reflex I talked about in the morning, right? So try to have your day organized. That sensation's not going to come when your child's strapped in the car for a half-an-hour car ride, right? Especially until they get the constipation under control, right? Once people have that system where they're not having dysfunctional voiding, well, then you have some buffer room that you can kind of play with it a little bit. But until that system is working again, you really do want to honor the physiology to get that back on track. Again, I mentioned that contract and relax the sphincter of the pelvic floor a couple of times. One of the things that can really help too is as we inhale, that's when our pelvic floor would relax. And as we exhale is when the pelvic floor naturally contracts a little bit. And usually people kind of want to actually push fecal matter out of their body when they exhale. But sometimes the pelvic floor is then contracting, and then so the body's fighting itself a little bit. So we suggest that for kids that they have a little straw that maybe they keep in the bathroom, and as they exhale and push, they blow through this straw because it helps change the pressure system so it can keep the pelvic tissues a little bit more relaxed and actually get some pressure in behind. So that's another strategy we use. And the other thing is no more than 5 minutes at one attempt. This whole business of like sitting on the toilet and like reading and sitting there for a long time, it's actually so bad for your pelvic health. You know, you should be in there, get your urge that you need to go, whatever it is, go in there, do your business, and you're gone. Like, it shouldn't be a dragged out process. And so no more than 5 minutes in one attempt. If nothing's happening in 5 minutes, yeah, no problem. Don't make it a big drama. No problem. Just wait, and when an urge comes again, do it again. Okay? So large, hard stools. So again, this is where some of the dietary piece is really, really important. So this is the part where, you know, our nutritionist on our team, Aunt Chora, or our naturopathic doctors, Dr. Amy and Dr. Erica, can give guidance if needed, because the dietary piece really is important. It's not a dietary consideration, but I have it up there as castor oil rubs. So castor oil is something that in the adult population I recommend a lot when there's tension in the pelvis and when there's constipation. And certainly our naturopathic doctors recommend it for pediatrics. Even for just general immune support, it's recommended that, you know, pediatrics do a castor oil rub from time to time. So, you know, definitely that would improve the gastrointestinal tract also. Gripe water has fennel oil in it, and fennel oil really kind of helps, you know, the gut to move a little bit. So that's been found to be quite helpful when there's constipation. And again, probiotics can be helpful, magnesium can be helpful. So there's a lot of nutrient deficiencies that can feed into this problem. So this is where our naturopaths and our nutritionists here can help you with that if you have more questions about that. Certainly exercise. So large muscle dynamic exercise just to get things moving is really important. but also disciplines of exercise like yoga that actually work to really wind that autonomic nervous system down. That can also be helpful. And stool softeners really should be a last resort. I mean, sadly, I did a Google search last night just almost to get a sense of what would the average parent get if they typed in a Google search, and like stool softeners is like one of the first things that pops up. You know, it really is, that certainly is not in the spirit of general health, having that as a frontline option, and honestly it doesn't even work half as well as all these other things. Okay, so they should really be a last resort. And then finally the pain on evacuation. And again, really just reframing that safe situation versus threatening situation. What is a safe stimulation to that rectum, and what is a threatening stimulation to that rectum, and helping both the parent and the child to understand that. The breathing techniques, the reverse Kegels again and again, that correct toilet setup. So you can see that each of these stages, there's so much crossover with those basic strategies that can be implemented. So what are just some other tips and tools? Well, using avoiding diarrhea can help, you know, avoiding either urine or feces. Positive reinforcement, we mentioned that was a strategy that there's quite a bit of literature around, so certainly using that as an adjunct strategy is helpful. And again, just having a system in place so it's not kind of controlled chaos and it's not all this defensive voiding, but one that's not anxiety provoking. You want to have a rhythm, but you don't want to have like a militant situation going on, but you do want to be mindful of what's happening, but try to have a situation that is really de-dramatized. So what about toilet learning? So a lot of the principles that we've talked about are obviously relevant just for toilet learning and getting situations correct right from the get-go rather than having to then treat problems that have manifested, right? That's the ideal, is having a situation set up that none of those things pop up in the first place, right? And this is a fairly complex sort of situation. It's not just like a physiological feat that, you know, you're in diapers and then now you're toilet trained. There's a lot that goes on with toilet learning. And certainly there's a lot of like psychological and affective aspects that feed into this, right? So if you are to kind of really follow more constructive toilet learning principles, usually that's going to translate to much more better global pelvic health for your child. And your child really does need to be involved in the whole process, right? The child's going to be the one who feels the urge. It's their body. So this needs to be respected always, right? Like, you know, really kind of looking at what's your interaction and behavior in terms of maybe sort of overriding their normal physiology to, so they can adhere to your timeline and know, I want you to go pee because we're leaving and I said so. Or I want you to try right now because it's convenient for me. Well, you know, that certainly isn't working well if your child actually has one of these dysfunctions. Right? But I would argue to set your child up for good pelvic health, you shouldn't really even start into that interaction in the first place. The child's also going to be the one who uses the evacuation technique, right? So they need to be involved in the process of what feels good and what's working for them, right? The parents, of course, need to facilitate the resources and set up and give the love and encouragement, but it's the child's body, it's their sensations, it's their physiology, and that really needs to be honored and facilitated. So these are just some averages from the literature, which to be honest isn't really that good when it comes to this. But generally, toilet learning averages for girls is around 2 years old, and they say for boys it's about a year later, around 3 years old. Okay, so that's just to kind of keep in mind. You know, I think as parents you'll be able to get a sense of if your child is kind of interacting with that process, provided hopefully that you implement some of these principles in a way that they seem excited to kind of make that next step in their development, then they're probably ready. But if they're really not having it right from the beginning, probably it's good to just pack it in and maybe revisit it a couple months later, right? Pull-ups do not facilitate toilet learning, right? So, you know, they do great marketing, and you'll spend a lot of money on these, but they don't facilitate toilet learning, because toilet learning is really about just understanding that cause and effect. That cause and effect of, oh, okay, I got that urge. Oh, and now liquid is coming out of me. Okay, you can't really facilitate that learning with a pull-up on. You just can't. So certainly, you know, what we would recommend is either like a bare bum method or underwear, like regular cotton underwear under a diaper. And, you know, the bare bum method can be nice because, you know, if you are with your child and you have, you know, little small potties set up around the main areas of your house and you're starting to see something's happening, you can put the child right on the potty so they make that connection, right? And they start to get, oh, okay, I get it. And then you can slowly start to kind of bring them into the bathroom, and they can kind of see that you and anyone else in the household are doing that. So there's a really quick cause and effect, and it's usually just a few days and the kids get it with that, okay? If that's not an option, then there also is the option of the underwear under the diaper, which hopefully they're getting like, oh, I'm wet and uncomfortable, because they can really feel it in that cotton underwear. And then they're kind of alerting you, oh, it's wet. And then you can say, okay, so when you have that sensation before it got wet, you need to go on the toilet. Okay, so I would say the bare bum method works a lot better. But the second best one would be underwear under a diaper.
Would that be the same as having like a cloth diaper on, or having a training pant on that is absorbent but still feels wet?
Yeah, so you would definitely want something that's really not that absorbent, though, because you'd want it to be really, really obvious, right? You wouldn't want it to kind of be a material that's going to pull away from the skin even a little bit, because you want it to be really obvious.
Okay.
So they kind of get that.
Why babies in cloth diapers are usually do toilet learning a lot earlier than disposable diapers, because they actually feel wet and they associate that with going to the washroom.
Yeah, so it makes perfect sense. It's definitely better for sure, but if you're really like wanting to nip it in the bud, you might find that diapers still absorb and pull away more from the skin than like a regular cotton underwear where it's like soppy and like it's really obvious. Okay?
But if you took the insert out of a cloth diaper, it would just be a big puddle of wetness inside.
Yeah, and so then that would work. Absolutely. Absolutely, because then you're losing that absorbency piece. Yeah.
The people from Wonderwear that we work with told us that they only have a handful of people who are over 2 in using their service anymore because they toilet learn so much earlier.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me at all, okay? Because again, it's really sort of acknowledging the child's, you know, innate intelligence and their physiology in their body, right? And that's sort of what I think we need to do a little bit more. So generally you do want to assume more of like a fun, non-threatening, non-judgmental approach. I know that, you know, sometimes parents can go into it and be like, oh my God, I just got to get them toilet trained and this is going to be a nightmare, and you might go into it, maybe not with that sort of optimistic, excited attitude, but I think if you can go in with it with a good attitude right from the beginning, your child will feed off of this, right? And if you have a really good optimal toilet setup, that's really going to help you. Do not commence toilet learning if there are constipation issues present. So this is something really important. I've had actually a couple emails about that saying, you know, yeah, my child has had this kind of consistent constipation issues, you know, they're 2.5, I really want to get them toilet learning. You need to have that working properly. If you're having that ongoing spasm in the pelvic floor and some of this fear avoidance around evacuation, it's not the best time to set up smooth sailing for toilet learning. So really getting the constipation nipped in the bud first, getting that going nice and smooth is going to set you up for toilet learning to be much easier. Okay? And just consider all of those factors we've talked about. So you can kind of get it right the first time, and that tends to work the best. So that was it for me. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions if anyone has specific questions.